The accidental decapitation by elevator. On August 16, 2003, a 35-year-old surgical resident arrived for his shift at Christus St. Joseph Hospital in Houston, Texas. The 35-year-old surgical resident had spent years training to save lives. That morning, he walked the familiar corridors of the hospital, passing near the medical library where he often studied between surgeries. It was a routine Saturday that would end in anything but routine. At approximately 9:30 a.m., he approached the second-floor service elevator. He pressed the call button and waited as the door slid open. What he couldn't know was that the safety mechanism on this particular elevator had malfunctioned. The doors were closing and opening erratically, a problem that maintenance staff had been alerted to but hadn't yet fixed. As he stepped partially into the elevator, the doors suddenly began to close. They clamped around his shoulders and head. In that instant, before he could react, the elevator car began to rise. The mechanical system hadn't registered an obstruction. It continued its programmed journey upward. The force was immediate and deadly. His body was caught between the rising elevator car and the concrete floor above. His head and shoulders were pulled upward while his body remained outside the elevator. The mechanical pressure against his neck was enormous. What happened next was witnessed by a nurse who was already inside the elevator. The rising force partially severed his head from his body. The separation wasn't complete, but it was extensive enough that death was instantaneous. The nurse, trapped inside with his remains, frantically pressed the emergency button. When emergency responders arrived minutes later, they found a scene so horrific that several experienced hospital staff had to turn away. The elevator had to be manually lowered to retrieve what remained of the doctor's body. Blood had spread across both the inside of the elevator car and the second-floor hallway. Investigators later determined that proper maintenance would have prevented the tragedy. The elevator's proximity sensor had failed, allowing it to move with its doors partially obstructed. The murder in the stacks. On November 28, 1969, a 22-year-old graduate student walked into Patty Library at Penn State University. She was working on a research paper due after Thanksgiving break. She wore a red dress that day, a detail that would later become tragically significant. It was approximately 4:30 p.m. when she entered the dimly lit stacks on level 2. The library was unusually quiet that Friday afternoon. Most students had gone home for the holiday. She made her way through row 51 of the English literature section, a narrow corridor of bookshelves that created a maze-like environment. Security cameras didn't exist in the stacks, and visibility between the rows was intentionally limited to maintain the library's academic atmosphere. At 4:45 p.m., witnesses heard a scream and the sound of books falling. It lasted only seconds. A male voice said, "Somebody better help that girl," before disappearing. When students in nearby rows reached her, they found her slumped between the bookshelves. She was still standing, her back against the books, but something was wrong. Her red dress concealed the blood. Those who discovered her initially thought she had fainted. They lowered her to the ground and attempted to help. Only then did someone notice a small tear in her dress directly over her heart. The single knife wound was so precise that it had pierced her heart, causing massive internal bleeding but little external blood flow. The wound was small, just 1 inch wide and deep enough to penetrate her heart. The medical examiner later determined the weapon was likely a hunting knife with a single sharp edge. The stab was delivered with such precision that she had only moments of consciousness after the attack. By the time emergency services arrived at 5:01 p.m., she had died from internal hemorrhaging. The killer had vanished into the labyrinthine stacks, leaving behind no fingerprints, no weapon, and no apparent motive. Despite an extensive investigation involving the FBI, her murderer was never identified. The Machete attack in the lobby. On January 20th, 2019, a 69-year-old library director arrived early at the Fort Myers Beach Public Library. The director had served the community for over 2 decades and was known for his punctuality. It was Sunday morning, just before 9 a.m., and he was preparing to open the doors for a weekend book sale. The sky was clear, the temperature mild, a perfect Florida winter morning. He approached the entrance with keys in hand. He had made this walk hundreds of times before. The library, a modern 2-story building with large windows, stood quiet before its scheduled opening. Regular patrons were already gathering outside, waiting for the doors to unlock. Some recognized him and waved as he approached. At 9:02 a.m., as he inserted his key into the front door lock, a man emerged from behind a nearby pillar. The assailant moved with deliberate speed toward the library director. In his hand was a machete with a 15-inch blade. Security cameras later showed that the attack was not random. The man had been waiting specifically for the director to arrive. The first strike caught him in the lower torso. The blade penetrated his abdomen with such force that it caused immediate internal damage. He collapsed against the glass doors, his keys still dangling from the lock. The attacker continued, striking him multiple times while horrified patrons screamed and ran for cover. Within seconds, the library entrance was covered in blood. The director remained conscious briefly, attempting to shield himself from the continuing blows. The machete struck his arms, chest, and neck. Each wound was deep, precise, and deliberately placed. Witnesses later described the attack as methodical rather than frenzied. Emergency services were called immediately, but by the time paramedics arrived 6 minutes later, he had lost too much blood. Despite resuscitation attempts, he was pronounced dead at the scene at 9:21 a.m. The attacker remained at the scene, machete still in hand, making no attempt to flee. Police later identified the attacker as a homeless man who had been previously removed from the library by the director for sleeping in the building. The volunteer's fatal beating. On May 24, 2018, a 59-year-old volunteer librarian opened the Christian Science Reading Room in downtown Ottawa, Canada. The librarian arrived at 10 a.m. to prepare the small storefront library for visitors. She had been volunteering there for many years, finding purpose in the quiet space filled with religious text. The reading room, nestled between busy shops on Laurier Avenue West, typically saw only a handful of visitors each day. Security footage from nearby businesses showed that the reading room remained quiet throughout the morning. No unusual activity was visible from the street. At approximately 12:30 p.m., a man entered the facility. Unlike most visitors, he didn't browse the collection. Instead, he approached the librarian directly at her desk near the back of the room. What happened next wasn't captured on any camera. The reading room had no security system, no panic button, and no witnesses. For nearly an hour, the man remained inside with her. At 1:40 p.m., he left the building alone, walking casually away from the scene. At 1:50 p.m., a fellow volunteer arrived to relieve her for the afternoon shift. She found the reading room unusually quiet. Calling out her name and receiving no answer, she walked toward the back office area. There she discovered the librarian lying on the floor, unconscious and severely beaten. Her face was unrecognizable from the trauma, and blood pooled beneath her head. Medical examiners later determined that she had been beaten repeatedly with fists, and possibly a blunt object. Her skull had sustained multiple fractures. The attack had focused primarily on her head and face. Her injuries indicated she had tried to defend herself, with defensive wounds on her arms and hands. Paramedics rushed her to the Ottawa Hospital's trauma center. Despite emergency surgery to relieve pressure on her brain, the damage was irreparable. For 15 hours, she clung to life, her vital signs gradually weakening. Her husband and family gathered at her bedside as doctors explained there was no hope for recovery. At 5:45 a.m. on May 25th, she was pronounced dead from blunt force trauma to the head. The deadly assault with a van. On November 9th, 2020, a 52-year-old librarian was at home in Polk City, Florida. They had spent the morning at the local library where she worked as the children's events coordinator. She was known throughout the community for her storytelling sessions and her passion for bringing books to life for young readers. That afternoon, she found herself involved in a confrontation that began over her son's broken relationship. At approximately 2:30 p.m., 4 teenagers arrived at her home in a van. Among them was the ex-boyfriend of her son. The relationship had ended badly weeks earlier, with accusations of stolen property. The teens had come to retrieve items they claimed belonged to them, but the situation quickly escalated. Security cameras from neighboring homes captured what happened next. She emerged from her house and began taking photos of the teenagers in their vehicle with her phone. She stood in her front yard, documenting their presence. This act visibly agitated the group. Witnesses would later describe hearing shouting from both sides. As she continued taking photos, the driver of the van suddenly accelerated. The vehicle, later identified as a church van that had been borrowed without permission, lurched forward directly toward where she stood. There was no attempt to swerve or brake. The van struck her at an estimated 30 miles per hour. Impact threw her several feet backward. Her head struck the pavement with crushing force. The van briefly stopped, then accelerated again, this time driving over her body as it fled the scene. Neighbors rushed to help, finding her unconscious with multiple crush injuries to her chest and severe head trauma. Paramedics arrived within minutes and found her still breathing, but barely. She was airlifted to Lakeland Regional Health Medical Center, where doctors immediately recognized the severity of her injuries. CT scans revealed extensive internal bleeding and devastating brain trauma. For 3 weeks, she remained on life support. Despite multiple surgeries and the best efforts of the medical team, her condition continued to deteriorate. On November 30th, 2020, she never regained consciousness after the attack. The death of the Mughal emperor. On January 24, 1556, an emperor was ascending the stone staircase of his personal library, the Sher Mandal, at Puranachila in Delhi. The 47-year-old Mughal ruler had reclaimed his throne just 6 months earlier after 15 years in exile. The library was his sanctuary, a 2-story octagonal tower where he pursued his passion for astronomy and literature. That evening, he carried several manuscripts and an astrolabe, planning to observe the stars from the rooftop. The staircase of the Sher Mandal was notoriously steep and narrow, designed more for aesthetic appeal than safety. Each step was made of polished sandstone, worn smooth by daily use. The stairs wound upward in a tight spiral, with minimal lighting from small windows set high in the walls. He had climbed these stairs countless times before, always careful due to their treacherous design. At approximately 7 p.m., As he neared the top of the staircase, the muezzin's call to evening prayer began. Court chroniclers later recorded that the emperor, a devout Muslim, attempted to kneel in response while still on the stairs. As he began to lower himself, his foot caught in the flowing robe he wore. For a brief moment, he struggled to regain his balance. The fall was sudden and violent. He tumbled backward down the entire length of the stone staircase. His body struck each step with increasing momentum. The manuscript scattered around him as he fell. Courtiers at the bottom of the stairs heard the commotion but could not reach him in time to break his descent. When attendants reached the emperor, they found him unconscious at the base of the stairs. Blood pooled beneath his head where it had struck the stone floor. His right arm and several ribs were visibly broken. Despite the obvious severity of his injuries, he was still breathing, though each breath came as a labored gasp. Court physicians were summoned immediately. They applied poultices to his wounds and attempted to stem the bleeding, but they lacked the knowledge to treat the internal injuries. The emperor never regained consciousness. For 3 days, he lay in his royal chambers as his condition steadily worsened. On January 27, 1556, the Mughal emperor died from what modern doctors would recognize as traumatic brain injury and internal hemorrhaging. The death by drunk driver. On July 15, 2023, a 37-year-old youth librarian finished her shift at the Belmont Library in Portland, Oregon. She had spent the day organizing a summer reading program for local children. Colleagues described her as passionate about her work, often staying late to ensure everything was perfect for the next day's activities. As a mother of 2 young boys, she had a natural ability to connect with the children who visited the library. At 6:45 p.m., she exited the library staff entrance. The summer evening was still bright, with temperatures hovering around 80 degrees. She walked toward the bus stop located just 15 feet from the library's property line. According to her routine, she would catch the 6:52 p.m. bus home to the apartment where her sons were waiting with a babysitter. She stood at the bus stop alongside 2 other commuters. Security footage from the library's exterior cameras showed her checking her phone, likely texting her babysitter about her imminent arrival home. At precisely 6:49 p.m., a black sedan appeared on the road, moving at a speed later calculated to be approximately 68 miles per hour in a 20-mile zone. The vehicle was weaving erratically between lanes. As it approached the bus stop, the driver lost control. Without warning or any attempt to brake, the sedan left the road and barreled directly toward the waiting passengers. The other commuters managed to leap clear in the final seconds. The librarian, still looking at her phone, had no time to react. The impact was violent. The sedan struck her at full speed, crushing her against the metal bus stop shelter. The force was so severe that the structure itself collapsed. She was thrown nearly 20 feet, landing on the library's lawn. The car continued another 40 feet before crashing into a utility pole. First responders arrived within 3 minutes. They found her unresponsive with multiple traumatic injuries. Her spine was severed at the 3rd vertebra, her pelvis shattered, and her internal organs had suffered massive trauma. Despite immediate resuscitation efforts, she was pronounced dead at the scene at 7:11 p.m. The driver, a 41-year-old man, had a blood alcohol level later measured at 0.21%, nearly 3 times the legal limit. The Petworth computer room, killing. On March 2nd, 2023, a 45-year-old regular patron sat at a computer terminal in the Petworth Neighborhood Library in Washington, D.C. The patron had been using the library's services for over a year, often spending hours researching job opportunities. That Thursday afternoon, the computer room was moderately busy, with about a dozen people quietly working at the long wooden tables lined with monitors. At approximately 4:15 p.m., a man entered the computer area and approached the patron. The person was later identified to be a 33-year-old homeless man who frequently used the library as shelter during operating hours. Security footage showed the 2 men had a brief verbal exchange. According to witnesses, it concerned a previous dispute over money. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds before the homeless man suddenly reached into his jacket. Without warning, he produced a large butcher's knife with an 8-inch blade. Before anyone could react, the homeless man lunged forward, bringing the knife down with tremendous force toward the patron's upper body. The first strike penetrated the patron's chest, piercing his left lung. Blood immediately sprayed onto the computer monitor in front of him. He attempted to stand but collapsed almost instantly. The homeless man continued his attack, stabbing him 3 more times in rapid succession. Each wound was deep and precise, targeting the victim's torso. Patrons scattered in panic, many rushing for the exits while others froze in shock. The patron, still conscious but rapidly weakening, fell sideways from his chair. He collapsed directly into the lap of a 62-year-old bystander seated at the adjacent computer station. They later described feeling the warmth of the patron's blood soaking through their own clothing as the victim gasped for air. 2 security guards and a librarian responded to the commotion, arriving within seconds. 3 male patrons had already tackled the homeless man to the ground, disarming him. The knife skidded across the floor, coming to rest under a nearby table, its blade coated in blood. Emergency services arrived within 4 minutes, but the patron's condition deteriorated rapidly. The knife had severed major blood vessels, causing catastrophic internal bleeding. Despite immediate medical intervention, the patron was pronounced dead at 4:37 p.m., just 22 minutes after the attack began. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.